All right, listener, get ready, because today we are diving into a really dark story. The case of Charles Ming,
Yeah.
a convicted serial killer who, with his accomplice, Leonard Lake, really shocked California back in the 1980s.
Hmm.
We're using excerpts from Ng's Wikipedia page as our main source here. So think of it like a psychological autopsy. Tracing Ng's path, from troubled beginnings all the way to him committing these really awful acts.
It is a pretty dark story, and it raises a lot of questions, like how can seemingly normal beginnings lead to such extraordinary evil?
Yeah, exactly. And Ng's beginnings are particularly interesting. I mean, he was born into a wealthy family in Hong Kong, the youngest child and the only son.
Right.
You'd think privilege, not exactly the typical path of a serial killer.
Yeah, that's where things get complicated, right? I mean, human behavior is complex. Now, Ing's childhood, despite the wealth, it was reportedly really difficult, marked by his father's harsh discipline and abuse. Now we see difficult childhoods often in the histories of violent offenders, but it's important to remember you can't just assume a direct cause and effect.
Right. It's not a straight line from having a hard childhood to becoming a murderer. But I am curious, do you think this harsh upbringing, could have contributed to Ng's behavioral issues? He was expelled from multiple schools, right?
It's certainly possible. Think about it. The psychological impact of constantly being criticized and punished, it's understandable that it might, lead to resentment and feeling alienated, difficulty forming, healthy relationships.
And instead of, trying to understand the root of the problem, his father sends him off to boarding school in England after Ng is caught shoplifting.
Yeah.
Was that really about, helping Ng, or was it more about controlling him?
It's hard to say for sure, but it does raise the question, right? Did that decision just isolate me even more, potentially making his problems even worse?
It seems like a missed opportunity to really intervene and try to understand what was driving, these early acts of delinquency.
And this pattern of stealing continues. He gets expelled from boarding school too, again, for stealing. So there's this emerging theme, right? Disregard for the rules, willingness to take what he wants, no matter the consequences.
And that disregard seems to escalate. When he moves to the United States in 1978 on a student visa, he goes to college in Notre Dame in California for a bit, but drops out.
Right.
Then he gets into a hit-and-run accident.
Right.
And makes a pretty wild decision.
Yeah.
He enlists in the Marines, using a fake birthplace so he can avoid prosecution. I mean, he's already showing a capacity for deception, for manipulation, a willingness to just bend the truth to get what he wants.
Absolutely.
That's a big jump. From troubled student to Marine, what do you think he was hoping to gain by joining the military?
Well, it's tough to know his true motivations. Was it some attempt to find structure, maybe discipline? Or was it just a way to escape the consequences of his actions?
Whatever the reason, it doesn't work out. Less than a year later, he's arrested for stealing weapons from the Kaneohe Bay Armory. His criminal behavior is escalating. It's becoming bolder.
Yeah, and while facing a court-martial, he does something pretty drastic. Escapes custody and flees back to Northern California. This is where he meets Leonard Lake, a really pivotal figure in his descent into darkness.
This is where things start to take a really dark turn. So tell me about Lake and his relationship with Nil.
Well, their shared interest in crime was obvious right from the start. In 1982, authorities raid their shared home and uncover a huge stash of illegal weapons and explosives. It shows you their fascination with weapons and their blatant disregard for the law.
So they were already on law enforcement's radar, but Lake gets away.
Yeah, he flees to this remote cabin, owned by his ex-wife in Wilsonville, California. Ninning, on the other hand, is caught, serves his time, and is dishonorably discharged from the Marines in 1984.
Setting the scene for their reunion and the horrifying chapter that's about to unfold.
Exactly. Upon release, Ning rejoins Lake at the cabin. And what they do next will cement their place in the history of true crime.
It's a terrifying thought, knowing that at this point their horrific crimes are about to begin. But before we dive into that, I want to look closer at Lake. He had already been exhibiting disturbing behavior before Ning even showed up, hadn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Lake was obsessed with this novel called The Collector. It's about a guy who kidnaps and imprisons a woman. And Lake was clearly fascinated with control and domination.
And that fascination materialized in a terrifying way at the cabin. He built a dungeon, right?
Yeah, he did. It was a literal interpretation of the book's themes. He even called his twisted plan Operation Miranda, after the female character in the novel.
So Lake was already headed down a dark path before Ning even got there. What do we know about the crimes he committed before their partnership?
Well, tragically, Lake had already killed two people, his own brother and his best man. It shows that the seeds of violence were sown long before Ning came along.
It's a truly disturbing picture of Lake's psyche. But how did Ning fit into all of this? Was he a willing participant, or was he manipulated by Lake?
That's the question we are going to explore as we delve into the details of their crimes and examine the evidence from the investigation.
It's going to be a dark journey, listener, but I think it's important to understand the complexities of evil and how someone like Charles Nunn could exist. We'll be back soon to continue this deep dive. Welcome back, listener. We were just talking about this really sinister partnership forming between Charles Nigg and Leonard Lake at that remote cabin in Wilseyville. Lake had already started down a dark path, inspired by that book, The Collector, and Nung showing up just seemed to fuel their shared depravity.
It's a frightening thought, isn't it? Two people with such disturbed tendencies coming together like that. And over the next year at that cabin, it was just a horrific spree of violence. They kidnapped, tortured, and murdered so many people. Men, women, even children.
It's hard to comprehend the level of cruelty. The sources describe how the women were subjected to prolonged periods of enslavement and abuse before being killed.
It just shows their complete disregard for human life. And later on, they found Lake's journals and videotapes, which documented their crimes in chilling detail. It makes you wonder what would drive someone, not only to commit these acts, but to record them like that.
Yeah, it's like they wanted to relive it, to savor the suffering they inflicted. One of those tapes was labeled Mig Ladies. It shows Ning tormenting a woman named Brenda O'Connor while he cuts off her shirt.
It's a clear reminder of the sadistic nature of their crimes. The tapes offer a disturbing glimpse into their lives, revealing a level of depravity that's difficult to understand.
It really is hard to imagine how anyone could be capable of such cruelty. But their reign of terror couldn't last forever. And it's almost ironic that their downfall came about because of Ning's need to shoplift.
It is a weird twist of fate, right? You would think someone who is capable of such calculated brutality would be a little more careful, but in the end, it was Ning's kleptomania that did them in.
So walk me through it. How did a simple shoplifting incident bring this whole operation down?
Okay, so picture this. Ning is in a lumber store in South San Francisco trying to steal a vise. An employee sees him and calls the police. Ning freaks out, throws the vise in the trunk of their car, and tries to run, but the police end up catching Lake, who was waiting in the car.
I can only imagine Lake's reaction knowing what he had to lose.
Well, at first he tries to stay calm, claims that he paid for the vise, but the officer notices something's off. Lake doesn't match the picture on his driver's license. Turns out he was using the ID of a missing person.
A fake identity, huh? Pretty classic tactic for criminals trying to avoid getting caught. But this seemingly minor detail turned out to be a fatal mistake for Lake.
Yeah, it did. They investigate further and find out the car also belonged to a missing person, and the gun Lake had was registered to yet another person who had disappeared. The pieces were starting to come together, and Lake knew it was over.
So facing the reality of his crimes, Lake takes a drastic measure.
Yeah, rather than face justice, he decides to take a dramatic way out. He asks for a pencil and paper, says he wants to write a note to his ex-wife, but he had a cyanide capsule hidden on him, and he swallows it right there in the interrogation room.
A final act of defiance, ending his life on his own terms.
It was a desperate attempt to escape accountability. But his suicide just made the investigation more intense. The police now had even more questions than before. And they start searching the car. They find a bullet hole in the roof, bloodstains, a stun gun, more bullets, and under the seat they find a utility bill with Lake's ex-wife's name on it, and that Wilseyville address.
That must have been the moment they realized that the cabin was the key to unlocking this whole mystery.
Right, they get a search warrant and head straight for that remote cabin, and what they find there is horrifying, like something straight out of a nightmare.
Yeah, the sources mention a dungeon and all kinds of disturbing items. Can you describe what they found for our listeners?
Okay, well, just imagine. Tools, handcuffs, women's clothing, makeup scattered all over the cabin. And then there's the bunker that Lake had built, this chilling embodiment of his dark fantasies. Inside, they find that book, The Collector, which was essentially the blueprint for his twisted Operation Miranda.
The novel that fueled his obsession with control and captivity.
Exactly. And Lake had even posted rules for his female captors on the wall, along with photographs of women, some of them nude. And behind a hidden door, they find this tiny windowless cell. It only had a mattress and a bucket inside. It's a chilling reminder of the suffering those women endured.
It's unimaginable the terror and despair they must have felt.
And the horrors didn't stop there. Near the cabin, investigators find a burial site. They unearth about 45 pounds of burned and crushed human bone fragments, representing at least 11 victims.
It's just staggering the scale of their depravity.
And on top of all that, they find Lake's meticulously kept journals and those horrifying videotapes.
Those tapes, as we mentioned earlier, provide a really disturbing and intimate look at their crimes. One shows Ing tormenting Brenda O'Connor, And another depicts the assault of Deborah Dubbs.
The tapes leave no doubt about their sadistic nature and their active participation in these horrific acts. It completely shatters any idea that Ning was just a passive observer.
So with Lake dead and all this evidence piling up, what happens to Ng? He doesn't stick around, does he?
No, he had already taken off to Canada. Remember, he told Lake's ex-wife that he had to get out of town. Right after that shoplifting incident, she even drove him to the airport.
It's a scary thought that she unknowingly helped him escape justice, maybe even saved her own life in the process.
Yeah, he probably felt the walls closing in and decided to seek refuge in another country, but his escape was short-lived.
He was caught in Calgary, right? And if I remember correctly, it involved another shoplifting incident.
You got it. It seems he just couldn't resist stealing, even with all the weight of his crimes on his shoulders. This time he was caught trying to steal a can of salmon.
A can of salmon. Really? It's hard to believe.
It's a bizarre detail, I know, but it just highlights how strong his compulsion was, and when security just to stop him, he shot one of the guards in the hand, which just further proved how dangerous he was.
So he's arrested in Canada, but his journey through the legal system is far from over. He didn't just agree to be extradited back to the U.S., did he?
No, he fought extradition every step of the way for years. His argument was that being sent back to California, a death penalty state, would violate his rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It became this huge legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada.
That's interesting. What were the implications of this case for extradition law?
Well, it was a landmark case. It really highlighted the tension between protecting individual rights and ensuring accountability for serious crimes.
And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled against Ng, didn't they?
They did. The court decided that the possibility of facing the death penalty in California didn't outweigh the need to hold him accountable for his alleged crimes. Ng was extradited to California to stand trial for the 11 murders, but his attempts to manipulate the system didn't stop there.
It sounds like Ng was determined to fight every step of the way, even with all the evidence against him.
His trial was long and drawn out, full of delays and legal maneuvering. It became one of the most expensive trials in California history, even more expensive than the O.J. Simpson trial.
Wow, that's incredible. What were the main factors that contributed to that astronomical cost?
Well, the complexity of the case, the amount of evidence, and Ng's constant efforts to obstruct justice all played a role. But the prosecution was determined to hold Ng accountable. They presented Lake's journals, the videotapes, forensic evidence, witness testimony. It was a mountain of evidence against him.
But throughout the trial, Ng maintained his innocence right. How did he try to defend himself against all that evidence?
He claimed he was just an observer, a pawn in Lake's twisted game. He tried to paint himself as a victim, someone under Lake's control. But the evidence, especially the videotapes, and the sketches of his victims that they found in his prison cell, all contradicted his claims.
So despite his attempts to deceive the court, the jury saw through his facade.
They did. The jury found Ng guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death.
A chilling end to a horrific chapter. But the story doesn't end there, does it? Ng's legal battles continued even after his conviction.
That's right, he's still on death row today, exhausting appeals and clinging to life. While the families of his victims continue to grapple with their loss, we'll dig into the aftermath of the trial and the wider implications of this case when we come back for the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back, listener. We left off with Charles Ng on death row, his legal options running out, while the families of his victims are still searching for peace and justice.
It's a harsh reality, isn't it? Aaron is dealing with the appeals process. But those who are affected by his crimes, they have to live with the consequences every day. Their pain goes way beyond, legal proceedings.
It's true, justice is about more than just punishment. It's about acknowledging the suffering of the victims and their families. Their stories, their loss, are at the very heart of this tragedy.
Absolutely. Their voices should be heard, their pain recognized. Ng's case, with all its brutality and the long legal battles, it's become a focal point in the whole debate about capital punishment.
Yeah, a debate that's been going on for ages. There's strong arguments on both sides. Some believe the death penalty is the only just punishment for the most horrific crimes, that it could offer some closure to the victims' families. Others think it's cruel and unusual punishment, a leftover from a less civilized time.
Taking a human life, even one as demonstrably evil as Ng's, is a huge decision that requires careful thought. It brings up complicated ethical and moral questions, like is it ever okay for the state to take a life, even in the name of justice? And can true justice ever be achieved in such awful circumstances?
Those are tough questions with no simple answers. But it's a conversation we need to keep having, looking at every side of the issue with nuance and compassion.
I agree completely. The death penalty is a complicated issue with serious implications. It's not about seeing things as black and white, right or wrong. It's about having a thoughtful conversation, understanding the weight of the decision, and considering everyone's point of view.
And as this debate goes on, the legal landscape around the death penalty keeps changing. California, for instance, currently has a moratorium on executions, put in place by Governor Newsom.
That's a big development. It means that even though Ung is on death row, he's not likely to be executed anytime soon. This adds another layer of difficulty for the families of his victims. It leaves them in a state of limbo.
It's a tough spot for them. They may never see the sentence carried out, which can make finding closure and healing that much harder.
It raises questions about the purpose of the death penalty. If it's supposed to bring justice and closure, what happens when that closure is delayed indefinitely? Or maybe never happens at all.
It's truly heartbreaking for those who've lost loved ones to violence. Their pain continues. And the legal system, while it aims for justice, can't always provide the comfort they're looking for.
This case, with all its legal complexities, shows the profound and lasting effects of Nengai's actions, not just on his victims, but on their families, the community, and society as a whole.
It's a ripple effect that reaches far beyond that cabin in Wilseyville. It forces us to confront the darkest parts of human nature, the capacity for evil that we all have within us.
And even with all that darkness, I think it's important to remember that we also have the capacity for incredible compassion, for empathy, for healing.
That's so important. While we acknowledge the darkness, we can't forget the light. The resilience of the human spirit, the strength it takes to rebuild after tragedy, the unwavering pursuit of justice. Those are all part of the human story, too.
Exactly. And maybe by looking into these dark corners, by wrestling with the tough truths they reveal, we can understand our foes better and try to create a world where these kinds of horrors are less likely to happen.
It's a hopeful thought, and I believe in it.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this disturbing but important journey, I want to thank you, listener, for joining us. May we all keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has the power to endure and to find meaning.